Hello, I'm Stuart Craner. Welcome to this series of monthly webinars, Inside Ecosystems, brought to you by the Business Ecosystem Alliance. Our aim at the Alliance is to further knowledge of the ideas and best practice driving the new generation of business ecosystems. With this objective in mind, I'm delighted that our two guests on today's webinar are real groundbreakers. First, we will hear from Annika Steiber. Annika is Director for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Menlo College and Director of the Rendanheyi Silicon Valley Center. Annika is the author of 7 books, including The Google Model, Management for Continuous Innovation in a Rapidly Changing World, The Silicon Valley Model, Management for Entrepreneurship, and Managing in a Digital Age, Will China Surpass Silicon Valley? Annika will provide an exclusive look at her new research, which identifies 8 models a corporation can choose from in collaborating with startups to maximize both knowledge transfer and innovation. With collaboration with tech startups increasingly identified as an important source of new technologies and business models, this is timely and important research. Annika is joined by Victor W. Hwang. Victor is founder and CEO of Victor & Company, an economic growth consultancy. He's founder and CEO of Right to Start, worth checking out, Right to Start, a campaign fighting to rebuild the economy by making entrepreneurial opportunity available to all. Previously, Victor was Vice President of Entrepreneurship at the Kauffman Foundation, co-founder and CEO of the startup Liquidity, and CEO and co-founder of T2 Venture Creation, a venture firm that built startup companies and designed ecosystems that fostered entrepreneurial innovation in dozens of countries and cities. He's also co-author of The Rainforest. Annika and Victor are both going to give short presentations on their work, and then we'll have a discussion. So feel free to let us know where you're watching from today and send us any questions you have during the session, and I will be sure to relay them to our speakers. So to get things started, Annika Steiber.
Thank you very much, and I will make sure that you can see it. So if you just give a sign, can you see full screen? Okay, so we're going to talk about entrepreneurial ecosystem and what I claim the rising B2B startup ecosystem. As Stuart said, I'm working for Menlo College in the heart of Silicon Valley and for the Rendanheyi Silicon Valley Center. And at the bottom of the slide, you have our website if you would be curious to learn more about what we do. So for today's agenda, we're going to go through very hands-on data and also frameworks that hopefully will be of big use for yourself. So I will try to be as tangible as possible and hands-on. The first thing we are going to discuss are driving forces behind corporate startup ecosystem, why this happened and why this is increasingly talked about and aimed for. Then we go into corporate objectives. Why do they do this? Why do they need to do this? We're going to discuss very shortly about the type of innovation they're looking for. And we're going to then go over to collaboration models. And there are 8 different categories of models that I'm going to present to you, and then connect those with the corporate objectives that you can achieve with the different models. And then I will end up with how do you then measure success? Because that is one of the problems today. Even if you understand and you want to build an ecosystem, you might not know how to measure the success of the ecosystem. So that is among the latest research to develop new KPIs. So let's go to the next one. So the rising B2B startup ecosystem and the driving forces. So one of the driving forces is that we have an increased number of and mobility of new tech experts. So when people start to move out from the big corporation where they might have been educated and taught new technology, they started to move out. And the reason for that was many. One was the rapid technology development. So they saw opportunities. And then the next one was growing availability of venture capital. So what we find is that we have an increasingly number of new tech experts in new technology, emerging technology areas that want to to exploit those new opportunities by doing a startup. So it's more and more of those tech experts that are outside of the incumbents, outside of the big corporation. And that is becoming a small issue or a big issue for the incumbents, of course. In the same time, the big incumbents, they experience shorter and shorter product life cycles, which means that they will have to get a return on investment in a very much shorter time space. And they also experience increased complexity of products. Suddenly, it's not enough to have mechanical experts and mechanical engineers that they were used to. Now they need an AI expert and a big data expert and cloud expert. And those experts might not be within the incumbent. And they might not be fast enough to recruit those kind of experts or be able to it. So the increased complexity of product means that they also need to start reach out to maybe potentially people outside, those tech experts outside of a company. So all this it leads to an increased need among incumbents to access new technology knowledge / experts, and also to share risk and cost because they need to make that return on investment in a shorter and shorter time frame. So let's go to Chesbrough research on open innovation, because this, I think, will explain it a bit. So this is a very, very brief description of a company. You can find research and the technology development, and then you have the go-to-market. In the old days, and that was only maybe 20 years ago, we had a closed model. So the line here is the border of the company. Everything was happening within the company. You did your own research. You had thousands of R&D experts in your own R&D lab. You did your own development, and then you went out to the market through your own channels. Everything was done vertically integrated by yourself. That changed, and we now talk about open innovation, which I think is the foundation behind the need of ecosystem and the creation of ecosystem. So suddenly, those incumbents, as I just told you, started to need to go outside and find those tech experts and the new technology knowledge. So they had to go outside and find new collaboration alliances with players outside. And that was not only on the technology side, but actually it was happening both on upstream and downstream. Upstream, they started to need to work together, go to market together, because again, the customer, the power of the customer is also increasing in the same time. So for you to be able to deliver everything by yourself is not more or less it's more or less impossible today. So you start to partner, and you need to partner also upstream to the market, to the customer, and then you need to do it downstream. And we have companies that are excellent doing both, like Hire, that is behind the Rendanheyi model. And we have companies that are excellent on doing, for example, downstream, where we work with new products and new technology in order to, as a new R&D. You can see it as a new version of R&D. You have your own R&D, but then you also work with external experts. So here are just two examples on great companies doing either upstream, downstream, or one of them. So my focus has been on open innovation, and I started actually my research on new management models. I was very curious about how can you manage to innovation, and I started that 30 years ago. And I've been studying everything from quality management over to the Google model, to the Facebook model, over to Chinese models, back to US again. And in the end, I focus very much on open innovation and ecosystem. So for 8 years, I've been focusing on open innovation ecosystem. I've been studying over 100 companies all over the world. My focus has been on both corporation and startup. This have led to a number of books, as Stuart mentioned, and also an award on leading management innovation research. But enough of that. I just want to give you a picture on the number of years and number of companies I studied. So what is the objective for corporations to do this? Why startups? So there are many objectives that we have found over the years. One is to rejuvenate the corporate culture. It might seem a little bit odd, but a lot of companies, incumbents, they are in absolutely need to rejuvenate the culture. They have to become entrepreneurial, and they are not. And one way of doing that is to work with startups. They can learn from them, and they can adopt their culture. The other objective is to innovate your brand. They have, in some cases, very hard time to find the new tech experts. Why do you want to get, to old generation company if you can work for one of the new generation companies? So they need to innovate the brand and become more attractive, not only to new hires, but also to customers. And of course, to startups, if they want to, collaborate with them. Then they want to solve business problems quicker and at lower cost, as I mentioned before. Product life cycles just getting shorter. They want to expand into future market by assessing new capabilities or ecosystem. They are not maybe even part of, say, cloud ecosystem. They're maybe not part of the AI ecosystem. They were not born in that time. And they want to get access to those ecosystems and to get access to that capabilities in order to move into that future market. And then it's a pretty interesting other objective, that is to build your own ecosystem for your current products. Okay, so if we believe that those are some of the objectives that big incumbents have to work for startup, how can that be done? First, the model depends on the objective. And that is something you really have to think through. You don't just pick a model, say one model could be corporate venture. You just pick that when you understand what are the objectives really you want to achieve. What do you want to aim for? And then you choose a model. So it's a pretty strategic decision. Okay, the other thing you need to think through is what kind of innovation do you want? Do you want Horizon 1 based on McKinsey's model, the 3 Horizon approach? Do you want the Horizon 1 to maintain and defend core business? Or do you want Horizon 2, nurture emerging businesses that you actually are aware of? Or do you want Horizon 3 to create generally new businesses that you 5-10 years ahead? The model will depend on what innovation you are looking for. And I can say my experience is that you usually work with startup in order to reach Horizon 2 and 3. It's really very hard to do Horizon 1 with startup. And there are many reasons for that maybe Stuart will ask and come back to later on. But Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 are the main horizons that I have met when I started companies. Okay, so let's go to the 8 models that we found out. In order to interpret this model, you start to look at the main dimension. One is if you take equity or not in the startup. If you take no equity, that means you don't take any share in the company. You don't buy any share. If you take equity, you buy a piece of the company. You buy maybe 3% or 5% or 10% or 20% of the company. You might buy 100% by acquiring it. The other dimension is direction of the innovation flow. Do you want to get innovation from outside and in? That is, you are looking for companies and tech experts from the outside. Or do you want to really leverage on innovation that you have developed from inside and bring it out? So those are the 2 main dimensions. And when we have those, we find 8 different models, which is inspired by Veblen and Chesper. The first one is the most known one and the oldest one, corporate venturing acquisition. You take equity, you're looking for experts from outside through startup, you take either a part of it or you just acquire it. We know a lot of the big innovation giants in Silicon Valley, they are expert on acquisition and they buy hundreds and hundreds of startups or invest in them or both. They usually do both. The next one is that you want to maybe explore innovation that you have developed and you want to bring it out. So you create a corporate incubator or you create a corporate accelerator and you accelerate own ideas and bring them out as startup. And you can put them in an incubator, for example, that you are in charge of. This is an excellent way to leverage on all your own innovation capabilities that you have. This can be a mix. You can also allow external startup into those corporate incubator and corporate accelerator. The next square is the platform and startup program. The platform is a typical Google platform or the Microsoft platform or the Apple platform, where you allow external companies to hook up to your own platform. But you're not maybe interested primarily in the external expert here to develop new innovation. You want their products, ready-made solution on your innovation, which is the platform. In the startup program, you create something like the Microsoft for Startup or Google for Startup. But what you do, instead of just coaching startup, is that you also allow them to use your own products. So we call that inside out. You deliver your platform or your own products to entrepreneurs outside. And then we have the latest one, which is the newest one, co-creation and co-location. You don't take any equity here. You do pure commercial relationship with startup, where you co-create new innovation together with startup, or you just invite them to sit very close to you, like the Bio Venture Hub that AstraZeneca have done in Sweden, which is very famous. And you let them sit next to you to get serendipity and get innovation through serendipity. If we then go back to the objectives, you will find that there are different objectives to different models. So rejuvenate culture or innovate your brand is definitely through both having corporate incubator, accelerator, co-creation, co-location. Is a great way to spur that brand of yours, or rejuvenate the culture, because you can have your own employees to go down to the incubator, be part of accelerator, or go down to the co-creation studio and learn about the culture and how startup works. You can also solve business problem through both corporate venture and acquisition, co-creation and co-location, primarily co-creation in this case. You can expand into future market through corporate venture and acquisition, corporate accelerator, corporate incubator, and then you can build your own ecosystem for your own products through platform and startup programs. So again, I want to emphasize that depending on the objective, you should be carefully choosing your model. And at the end of this slide, you can see the link to a research paper where you can find all the data you need in order to learn about those 8 models. And it was written by me and 2 research colleagues. Okay, finally, how do you measure success? And we have recently published a very, very easy 3-dimensional model that you can use. One is the stakeholder perspective. You have to understand that the startup have their own goals and objectives, the incumbents have their own objectives, and then you might have your government that has actually funded part of this new collaboration. They have their objective, and you might have an external accelerator involved, and they have their objectives. So you need to make sure that you understand the different stakeholders' perspective. Then you need to understand what are the KPIs for the performance you want to reach. What kind of result do you actually want? Do you want a rejuvenation of your culture? Do you want to access market share in a new market? What do you want to achieve? Then you need to understand the time dimension. What expectation did everyone have before you started? What KPI do you measure during the project? And what do you want to achieve after the project? So, just to give an example, this is an example again from one of my research paper. And this is just a dummy example on how you can make your own scorecard regarding performance KPIs per stakeholder. And as you see here, we have the incumbent, we have the startup, we have the dyad, which is the sort of accelerator or the collaboration unit. It could be your incubator. And then we have the government. And then we want learning, we want new knowledge, we want increased productivity, we want more innovation, we want new businesses, or we want to transform our business. All of those have different KPIs. So you need to be very skilled and set new KPIs. It's a whole new set of KPIs that didn't exist before. Okay, finally, as I just had 10 minutes, I want to wrap it up by saying that if you want to learn more from the Rendanheyi Center in Silicon Valley and my research, and also leading instructors research, you should take part of the next course that is coming up from our center in September. And you are going to get that link from Stuart. And the next course is called Leading for Exponential Impact with John Hagel, famous all over. Thank you for me, and that was everything I had.
Thanks very much, Annika. So now we're going to move from Menlo Park to Kansas City and Victor Hwang. Victor has a great track record as an entrepreneur, author, and consultant. Let's cut to the chase. Over to you, Victor.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. And I should also add, I spent almost a decade in Silicon Valley. So a lot of my talk is going to be around the nature of Silicon Valley, but what that means for the rest of the world. So I titled my talk Rainforests and Beyond, because a lot of the work, as you'll see, is around the concept of rainforests and natural ecosystems. But then and beyond is focusing on how we actually translate that out into application in the world. So I'm happy to share a lot of that with you, and thank you for having me here. So what we want to do is we want to open the door. So we often think of ecosystems in the abstract sense, but what I like to do is to actually take you through that door so we can actually travel into the ecosystem. And this is actually out of California, the redwood forests, which are actually a form of rainforest. So the Pacific redwood rainforest is actually a very unique rainforest. But what I wanted to do is to actually start by looking out across the very top of the canopy. When you look out across an entire forest, it looks like an ocean, it looks like a sea. It looks very, you really don't pay much attention to the individual trees when you look at it from high above. But as you start to get down and you start to look up, those of you that have ever spent time in the redwood forest know it's quite spectacular when you look up and you see the sunlight coming down through these thick trees and the beautiful redwoods that can grow for hundreds, even thousands of years, and how they grow to up to 300 feet. You actually get a very deep appreciation for the power of nature, but it starts to look different because when you're on the ground, you start to notice individual trees. But if you go even deeper, and this is what I used to do a lot when I was living in California, is you go and you actually look at the cones that were coming out of the redwood forest, and you look at the cones coming out of the trees, and you start to think about that. Well, you can actually take these cones and you can break the seeds apart. When you break the seeds apart, you find that there's these little seeds. And one really interesting thing about redwood forests is that it only takes about 1 out of every billion of these seeds to make it in order for the forest to sustain itself. That is, out of these 1 billion little startups, only one startup needs to succeed in order for the whole forest to continue to thrive and adapt and grow, which is fascinating. But it also says something about the startup environment, which is it actually takes a lot. It actually is a huge Herculean effort to take something from a seed up until the time it grows. Now, human beings are actually kind of the same way. If you think about a vast ocean of people, it kind of looks like a forest from high above. It's like a sea of people, and it's very hard to tell the difference between any one individual. You notice the crowd movements, but you don't notice the individuals. But if you get down to the level of the seeds, that is the actual individuals, and you see how they function together, you notice that different from redwood seeds, which are solo, you have human beings actually work in teams. They interact. And this is, in fact, where innovation happens. It actually happens at the level of small groups of people thinking about things, envisioning the future, building things together, and creating things. So if you think about this and put it into a diagram, you can see that everything starts with individuals. They form teams as they start to grow. Then they actually, if that team starts to come up with an idea that could stand on its own, then it becomes a startup company. Then if that startup company becomes successful, it grows. And then it becomes a mature company, and then eventually it becomes an institution that becomes embedded into the fabric of the entire ecosystem. And this is similar to the way little seeds sprout into giant redwood trees and redwood forests, is the same way that individuals build teams and companies. And so you can think of it the same way, that when we actually start to measure a company, we tend to think of it as the tree and up. But actually, there's this deep root system below that. And that root system is what happened to the individuals and teams that caused the roots to grow into fruits in the top of the tree. And so when we think about that, though, it really helps to realize that it's not a place. So when you look at the whole stack of behavior and the process by which teams grow into companies, Silicon Valley is not a place so much as it's a state of mind. I'm obviously not the first person to say that, but it's very true. But then the question is, well, what is a state of mind? How do you unpack a state of mind? What do you do with that? These ecosystems are actually invisible. You can't actually see an ecosystem in an abstract sense because you don't see all the behaviors and the things that are happening within the system. So how do we architect what's invisible? In fact, this became the great challenge that I set out to do when I showed up in Silicon Valley years ago. I thought how do we actually start to systematize and put a map around this invisible thing that no one's able to grasp, but we can feel and we can see the outputs of? And so the model that I and some colleagues developed is called the Rainforest. And the best way to understand the rainforest is by looking at the opposite, which is by looking at farms. So when you look at farms, what do you do on farms? Well, you try to find crops to grow, and you find one crop to grow, say it's corn, and you want to maximize the growth of that crop. And so what you want to do is grow lots of that crop, maximize the growth per yield of that crop. You put pesticides, weed killers, herbicides to kill other weeds. You try to make sure that that crop is maximized. One crop. But what's in a rainforest? What's a crop in a rainforest? Well, there is no one crop. Everything starts as a weed and has the potential to turn into something really valuable. You just don't know what that valuable thing is at the beginning. In fact, the nurturing of that initial seedling could become the most valuable plant in the entire forest. You just never know till you give it a chance. And so that's the thing about rainforests as opposed to farms. On a rainforest, you want the weeds to grow. But the way you build a farm is very different from the way you build a rainforest. Can you build a rainforest by planting lots of trees? Well, no, people have tried and it doesn't work. And it's because it's the interaction of all the things. It's the sunlight, it's the humidity, it's the nutrients in the soil, it's the interactivity of all the flora and fauna in the system. Well, human systems are the same way. They're the rich interaction of all the different components in an ecosystem, just like in nature. I had the fortune of studying under one of the greatest biologists in history, Edward O. Wilson, and this idea that ecosystems and the interaction of all things in a natural system is really core to all forms of life, including human life, including our economic activity. So when you actually break it down, though, if you start to think, all right, what makes a rainforest a rainforest? What turns weeds into crops? You find that there are actually certain patterns of behavior that show up over and over again in innovation ecosystems. These are, in fact, like the operating system of a highly innovative ecosystem, like Silicon Valley, and like many others that are emerging today. And so we can actually break those behaviors down. I won't go into all these in detail, but I'll just read through them fairly quickly. The rules of the rainforest that drive innovation. Break rules and dream. Envision the future. Number 2, open doors and listen. That is, be open-minded to new ideas. Trust and be trusted. Seek fairness, not advantage. Experiment and iterate together. Err, fail, and be persistent. It's okay to make mistakes, but as long as you keep on trying. And then pay it forward. That is, you're always giving back to the system. You're not necessarily expecting something in return immediately. Now, if you contrast to the rules of the farm, the rules of production, this is the rules of efficiency, the rules of scale, they're actually a different set of behaviors. And I won't go into these in detail either, but I'll just walk through them quickly. Excel at your job, be loyal to your team, work with those you can depend on, seek a competitive edge, do the job right the first time, strive for perfection, and return favors. Those all sound great. The left sounds great. The right sounds great. Now, the thing to pay attention to is that these items, these rules are actually paired up. They're actually opposites. The difference between opening doors and listening is to be loyal to your team, because if you're opening doors and listening, you're going outside. You're not spending time with your team. You're listening to all sorts of ideas that are not on your team right now. Being loyal to your team is around focusing on the ideas and the people that you have right there. And these all pair up. They're actually opposites. And there's more online if you want to dig into it, but trust me, they're all opposites of each other. And so they're all good, but then you can actually break them down into values. Openness, diversity, serendipity, fairness, experimentation, play, and giving are actually the parallels of that first set of rules of the rainforest. These are the values that underlie the rules. And then similarly, on the right-hand side for crops, you can find values that actually embody those rules of farming on the other side, which are the rules for scale and excellence and quality. And you see those as well. These are opposites as well. Diversity is the opposite of loyalty. Giving is the opposite of reciprocity, where you actually expect something back. So these are opposite values at work between innovation and production. And when they all come together and teams are able to form, you see this interaction between all the different pieces of the system. This is just one diagram from my book, The Rainforest, that talks about how all these different pieces fit together in an ecosystem, which just shows that you can't actually build this unless you start with the people and the values and the sets of behaviors that form the operating system of a society. And so when the little weeds are sprouting through the cracks, that is actually innovation. And we look at this not just in biology, but we think about this in terms of humans and ideas. And one of the reasons these ecosystems like the Valley work so well is because they're able to spot these nascent weeds that are coming out of the ground, trying to break through the cracks in the sidewalk. So where did all this lead? I've been working on these ideas for quite some time now. I've been involved in entrepreneurial innovation for over 2 decades. Well, there's been 3 books written about the rainforest: the original Rainforest, which won a Book of the Year award, the Rainforest Blueprint, because a lot of people couldn't read the 300 pages of the rainforest, and honestly, it was too much for them to grasp, including my mother. But then there's also the Rainforest Blueprint, which is like a short, colorful movie trailer version. And then there's the Rainforest Scorecard, which is an applied tool for measuring innovation at scale and for designing systems to grow. And then we designed a set of tools like Rainforest Canvas, and this is available for free on my website, where this is actually a tool you can use for building ecosystems, where it breaks it down between all the different components of an ecosystem and gives you prompting questions that actually can be used. And this has been used in Brazil and parts of Europe and North America and South America and the Middle East and East Asia. People have been using the Rainforest Canvas to design and build their ecosystems. And then we built a conference out of this called the Global Innovation Summit, which was focused on how you build rainforests. We had over 1,500 people from 50 countries and partners like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank that were part of taking these ideas to actually translate them into global development terms. And you can see the work actually done in those photos where people actually worked on teams for ecosystem design, depending on the continent they were from or the society they were from or the problem they were trying to solve. Everyone brought their own ecosystems and worked together on solving those things. And then buildings have been built. I thought this was pretty cool. This is the Lobo Rainforest of the University of New Mexico. They actually took the ideas of the rainforest and translated it into physical plant. So the heart of the innovation ecosystem of the University of New Mexico is actually the Lobo Rainforest, Lobo being their mascot, the wolf. And then from my time at the Kauffman Foundation, we built a summit to translate ecosystem building principles stemming from the rainforest into practice, into economic development, mostly in the United States, but all 50 states in the US, but also 10 countries around the world. And the eShip Summit, short for entrepreneurship, focused on building entrepreneurs' ecosystems and economies. And now that has led to the translation, taking those ideas and actually building an ecosystem building playbook, now in its 3rd iteration, 3.0, which has been used by a lot of communities across the world, which breaks all these ideas down that are very abstract into really concrete terms on how you actually drive and build the development of these ecosystems. And this is available for free as well on the Kauffman Foundation website, with a link from my website as well. And that translated into a set of goals, which are kind of like, if you're familiar with the United Nations Strategic Development Goals, we created a set of eShip goals, which are like strategic development goals for building entrepreneurial innovative ecosystems, which are now hundreds of people have been working across the country to adopt these things into practice to lift up the field of ecosystem building as a practitioner method for economic development. And very pleased, just a few months ago, the International Economic Development Council, which is the certifying body of economic developers in the world, actually has launched a certification course for entrepreneurial ecosystem building based off of these ideas as well. And that was seeded from my time at Kauffman, and we're very proud to support them. But they've actually launched now a full certification course. And the great thing about that is thousands of people now who officially do economic development can get trained up now on how you build ecosystems specifically to drive economic development across cities and states and regions. So to kind of move into the present, what I'm working on right now is to take these ideas and actually move them into the policy infrastructure. And if you think about the debates in most countries today, especially a lot of the developed countries, entrepreneurship actually is still an abstract concept. And there's a lot of spotty ways to support entrepreneurial policy. But what we did is we built out a policy agenda for entrepreneurship focused on the United States, but with applicability for the rest of the world, called America's New Business Plan. This was built with some leading thought leaders, including former advisors to presidents of the United States on economic affairs, as well as a lot of people involved in the ecosystem entrepreneurship innovation world. And now there's they've got a coalition called Start Us Up, which has over 200 organizations that have endorsed this policy agenda. It's the most comprehensive policy agenda for entrepreneurship ever proposed. But embodied inside it are ecosystems, and the concepts of the rainforest are wed throughout this work. And then most recently, I've launched this organization and campaign called Right to Start. We're a campaign to make entrepreneurial opportunity a public priority. That is, we believe it's a fundamental right. Just like you've got a right to speech, you've got a right to worship, you've got a right to assemble. We believe that you have a fundamental right to start. That is a right to be entrepreneurial. And the role of society is to protect that and nurture that. And so we've been doing this work. It's regardless of one's race, place, or background across every community possible. And we've got 15 communities now across the United States that are implementing Right to Start chapters. We've got a network that's starting to grow. The Atlantic magazine called us a guide to the next America. I've been writing furiously. I write regularly for Inc. magazine and Make magazine now. I've written for National League of Cities, City Lab and Bloomberg, Business Insider, The Hill, specifically to get these ideas going. And just about a month ago, we actually saw the first ever Right to Start Act passed in the Missouri House of Representatives, which is the most comprehensive pro-entrepreneur legislation ever proposed in the United States. So we've been excited about that, and we're starting to see that movement grow as well. But it all flows from this idea that ecosystems and the ways you think about ecosystems and the interactivity of all the parts of a system actually should be the way we drive long-term economic prosperity. But to do that, we've got to translate the work to economic development and to policy making so that it can thrive and sustain over long periods of time. So thank you very much. I welcome the chance to talk about this and any questions and insights anybody might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. And thank you, Annika, before Victor. Annika's based in Silicon Valley. You've got lots of Silicon Valley experience, Victor. So a question here is Silicon Valley tired? Is it still a valid role model? I mean, you look at what's happening in China. I've read Amy Webb's work about the Big Nine in China, and there's lots of clusters in China which seem to be setting the pace. So is Silicon Valley already past? Is that ecosystem dead? Annika, do you want to?
Yeah, I would love to start. Absolutely not. No way. No. They Silicon Valley. They take up the competition, and the activity level here is very high right now. It's a lot of interesting new companies starting up. The ecosystem is intact. The money that is invested in startups, even during COVID, has been great. So I have not seen any reduction in either activity level or interest. Opposite, actually. Now it's up to Silicon Valley to show that they are who they are.
Victor, what's your take on Silicon Valley now?
I think the answer is a solid maybe, which is, I think, if you look at the thing to think about the Silicon Valley is not as a single point in time, but as a historical arc. And if you look at how things have evolved over time in the Valley, it's very different today. If you spend time with the people that were there in the Valley in the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s, it's a very different type of person than a lot of people that are coming to the Valley today. And the culture is different in the Valley than it used to be. That doesn't mean the Valley's over in an immediate sense. There's a lot of momentum there, and there's a lot of resources there to continue to power it. But I think in terms of the values and the culture, it's just shifting over time. And every great place changes over time, from Florence in the Renaissance to the Netherlands during the Golden Age. Everything has its moment. And at the heart of it, if you think of the root system of Silicon Valley, there's still a lot of genuine spirit and entrepreneurial energy. But we are seeing more and more of that being replicated in other parts of the country. There are almost every city, I'd say mid-sized city and up, has some sort of entrepreneurial ecosystem that's starting to build, which wasn't there 10 years ago. And you're seeing that model of building ecosystems is emerging across the entire country, which is actually going to put competitive pressure on the Valley over time. But it also means that the concept of the Valley is just being democratized, and the Valley, as it's been existing, is just going to be part of that larger democratization of the Valley. The Valley shifted from the Valley to San Francisco and then the East Bay, and now you can think of it as the rest of America starting to follow too.
Okay. So one ecosystem breeds another ecosystem. You talked about the failure rate of entrepreneurs, and I think we've all seen the statistics about the number of people who start businesses and small number that succeed. And Victor's Rainforest analogy, the huge trees and 1 billion seeds to keep the forest active. So we're kind of comfortable with the idea of the failure rate of entrepreneurs, but is there a failure rate of ecosystems? And presumably there must be some sort of turnover of ecosystems.
I can go on that. I haven't studied specifically failure rate of ecosystem, but I do know that it's a lot of. If I come back to what I presented before, the incumbents, they understand now that they need to create ecosystem and they need to access new ecosystem. Their history and their trajectory is, however, not usually fit for that. So their learning process can be, if they are fast, they might do it in like 3 to 5 years to learn how to work in this new way and to work in a win-win situation. You talked about fairness, Victor, to really create a fair model between the incumbent. For some incumbent, it can take up to 10 years to learn. And it's so many forces within the incumbent that has to be overcome. With not invented here, with top management that might not really understand why they do this. You know, it's not really 100% bought in. It's not part of their new R&D strategy. It's not part of their new marketing strategy. It's something that, you know, many research have been writing about, that it's more of a branding thing than actually, you know, a true intentional strategic decision that this is going to happen, and it's coming from the top and down. That is lacking in many cases.
I'd say there's a life cycle to ecosystems. I don't think they fail, you know, one day versus another day. But if you just go back several decades in the United States, you know, the most innovative ecosystems were in along the Midwest, and you think of places like Rochester, which had companies like Kodak and Xerox at one point. They were the innovation hubs, and Detroit was one point the most innovative hub. And you think about now today, you see the emergence of lots of other places across the world that are starting to become highly entrepreneurial and innovative. So I think there's a life cycle, there's an ebb and flow. I think the key is not to focus on the trees so much as the root systems. And so I think that tends to get ignored a lot, which is if you have a good root system, the tree can weather bad seasons and bad storms. But what happens is over time, a lot of root systems start to die. And so the key in trying to rejuvenate these systems is actually to create what I call recreate the frontier culture. So if you look at the United States, for instance, the line of innovation moved east to west over the last 200 years. And if you can recreate the conditions of being in a frontier where people are new, where ideas are fresh, where relationships are unformed, and people are forced to try to rejuvenate themselves, then you can actually design those types of environments. And that's very possible. We do that kind of design all the time, where you bring together, you know, when you go to college, you're with students you've never met before. And that's a frontier in a way where people are having to build new friendships that never existed before. So how we design frontiers, how we design ecosystems from the root system up is actually something that's forever, but the life cycle certainly can end over time.
Could I comment on that, Stuart, as well? Because I do want to echo the importance of the root system, as Victor called it. For me, that is educational system. So I'm in higher ed, and I think we need to, entrepreneurship has to be part of any kind of education in the future. And I know I wrote a chapter in my latest book about China and Chinese development into an innovation country. One of the most important things they did, of course, they learned about the ecosystem, and they adopted that and they created it with venture capital funding and all that. But the educational system to actually fund and start to create an entrepreneurial culture and a view among both students and parents in China that entrepreneurship was a new career, right? You have to start from that level. Absolutely.
You could say that business schools in the West have been teaching entrepreneurship for quite a long time, and it hasn't made a notable difference as far as I can see. And aren't startups and large corporations in the end incompatible? Because there's a long history of corporations with their incubator units, and they call them various different things over the last few decades. But there's no real evidence, as far as I can see, that the gulf of misunderstanding between entrepreneurs and corporations is actually narrowing. mean, if you look at some companies like Microsoft, their track record of actually acquiring small companies and then not really leveraging their people or knowledge is actually quite extensive. So to some extent, are we there's the rainforest, perhaps we're barking up the wrong tree. Sorry, you started the metaphor, so I thought I'd carry on.
Yeah, let's just beat it. I think if you spend time with people in the corporate world and spend time with people in the startup world, they're like different animals, and they're just they have such different ways of looking at the world. They have such different value systems, but they need each other, and they depend on each other. Just like in an ecosystem, mature redwood trees actually need the little redwood trees to rejuvenate themselves. One really interesting analogy for the way that redwood forests function is that the root systems in redwood forests are actually very shallow. Even though the trees are up to 300 feet tall, the roots only go down about 6 to 12 feet. So it's very easy for redwood trees to fall over. But what they have to do to survive is they actually have to interlock their root systems. So the root systems of these trees tie together intentionally so they actually don't fall over, which is actually very similar in the startup world. The little trees and the big trees actually need to hold hands to grow and shoot up for the sky to fight for sunlight and humidity. And if they don't, then the system itself fails. So I think there's an inherent dynamic tension in between the big and the little that actually makes all of them succeed, if you can get the balance right.
And we should refer to The Secret Life of Trees, which suggests that the trees communicate with each other in some ways we don't really understand. And if you wanted to carry on the metaphor, you would refer to the rewilding movement.
I totally am with you on that. In fact, I've been thinking a lot about the rewilding movement because if you think of a very large company-dominated culture, it's essentially a monoculture, the equivalent of monoculture in the way we plant and even keep our lawns. So what does rewilding look like in the economy? And I think you could actually say that's parallel to the movement against corporate concentration and some of the antitrust policy that's emerging today.
So, Stuart, if I can comment on that as well, I do see actually an increased professionalism among incumbents to work with startup. As I said, it's a learning process for them, but some of them have actually gone through that 3 to 5 to 10 years of learning process and are doing really well now. But you have to create, as I showed you, the stakeholder mapping. You have to understand the different objectives from different stakeholders. And there are usually a set of key people within incumbents that truly understand the startup and act as a bridge, as a translator into the big corporation. And that is slowly changing the big corporations also way of thinking and mindset. So some of them have really become very professional.
And do you think that the world, I mean, I often look at it from the perspective of corporations, but do you think entrepreneurs are looking at big corporations in a different way? They see them, instead of some enemy or some monolith, they see them as potential partners and people they can collaborate with. Do you think the attitude is changing, Victor?
Yes and no. I mean, there are big companies that just do their big company thing, and there's others that are highly aware and innovative and reach out. I think the Silicon Valley model goes to, if you go all the way back to the days of HP, which birthed the modern Valley, it was the boundary, as Annika was talking about, the boundary between little company and big company was permeable. Things moved back and forth, people moved back and forth, products and suppliers moved back and forth between those boundaries. And it's a much healthier thing for the whole system. But there's always temptation for the big company to close down the boundary and say, I win, and I'm going to put up the walls. And so constantly building systems that incentivize the lowering of those boundaries and those transaction costs and barriers are actually key to sustainable systems.
How designed and deliberate can these ecosystems be? Because we're talking about, I mean, at the heart of entrepreneurship is the individual and spontaneity and creativity and collaboration. I'm just kind of concerned how there are things that seem incompatible with designing an ecosystem and deliberately designing an ecosystem.
Well, you can't manufacture outcomes, but you can engineer serendipity. And you can create environments that actually cause collisions to happen and teams to form. And we know this is true because we do it all the time in many contexts, whether it's the way we design colleges and universities or schools, but it's also the way that design thinking works. One of the things that fascinated me, I spent a lot of time with the folks involved in the design work at Stanford and realized that the principles of design have been applied towards products, but they haven't been applied towards economies. And I think that's what we're actually thinking of, is what does a human-centered economy look like? What's the user experience of an economy? And so if you bring it down to that level, of course you can design it. It's just, we design experiences all the time. It's just that you want an environment where your experience is one of trust and giving, of interactions with new ideas and people. And when people go through design thinking processes and workshops, for instance, they are actually designing exactly the Rainforest preconditions as well.
Annika, some final thoughts? We're running out of time.
Yes, absolutely. I would like to catch up on the last question first. Or let's come back to your question that you had before that. So the big incumbents are the startup are definitely looking at the big incumbent in very different ways. If you are in a very early phase, you want to do a collaboration with a startup just to test your technology. Usually, you want to do some kind of proof of concept. You want to test in order for you to be able to scale that technology further. If you're a more mature startup, they're usually looking at an incumbent as a paying customer potential. So a paying customer would be the aim. So again, coming back to the different objectives. Could you repeat the last question again? Because I did have something important to say there.
How much can ecosystems be deliberate and designed?
Yes. So I will say that, as a researcher and specific consultants, we will try to sell models. This is like change management. This is a learning process. It's a huge, long learning process. There is no blueprint. You can get some advice on what other people have done. You can get a sort of a kickstart package on how to maybe start it. That you need to have a part of your strategy. You need to, what kind of objective you want to achieve with your ecosystem. Then start to looking at certain players that would fulfill that, and start learning. And then it grows. It's an evolution. It's a learning approach. It's not a full blueprint. This is the way you do 5 years from now, and you will have a perfect ecosystem. That doesn't exist.
We're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Rick Spann in particular, who mentions another metaphor, which is jazz metaphor, which I'm all for. Thank you very much, Rick. Rick's joining us from Amsterdam. Thank you from Anwar from Kuwait, Victor from Dominican Republic, Margaret from Jacksonville, Alexandra, as always, from Poland. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Annika Steiber, for joining us from Menlo Park. Check out Annika's work and the work of the Rendanheyi Center of Silicon Valley. And Victor Hwang joining us from Kansas City. Check out Victor's work. Where's the best website for you, Victor?
VictorH.co.
Couldn't be simpler. So, Victor and Annika, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to talking with you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you.